Assalamualaikum. Today we'll be discussing about hierarchy of courts and doctrine of stare decisis. Therefore, firstly, I would show you the hierarchy of Malaysian superior courts for three eras. So prior to 1985, the Privy Council was the final court of appeal for Malaysia. The Privy Council appeals were allowed on criminal and constitutional matters only until 1 January 1978, while the appeals for civil matters were abolished on 1st January of 1985. Proceed to the next one, the second era, which is the Federal Court was also renamed as the Supreme Court of Malaysia on 1st January 1985, with the abolition of the appeal to Privy Council, which is the Supreme Court, became the Court of Appeal of the last resort in Malaysia. Finally, we move to the third era, which is on 24th of June 1994. As part of reforms, the court was once again renamed the Federal Court of Malaysia. Moving on to doctrine of stare decisis in Malaysia, it is a two-way operation which are vertical and horizontal. In terms of vertical, the material facts are the same. A court must follow the prior decisions of a higher court and its own prior decision. As for the horizontal, some courts are bound by their prior decisions and prior decisions of a court of the same level, whether past or present in the same hierarchy. The Privy Council became the highest appeals court for numerous Commonwealth nations when the British colonized Malaya. Although the Privy Council was the highest court in Malaysia, its rulings were binding on all Malaysian courts because it was a Malaysian institution. All Malaysian courts had to abide by its ruling based on two circumstances. So first, when the Privy Council ruled on a Malaysian appeal, it did so in the capacity of a Malaysian court. In accordance with the ruling of Wong Silong against Saraswati Amal, the verdict was binding on all Malaysian court. Second, the Privy Council acted as the highest court of the common law nation when it decided an appeal from that nation. So its ruling had no legal effect on Malaysian courts. It was merely persuasive. Decisions of all courts must follow the federal court's ruling. So the two high courts as well as the lower courts are bound by the decision of the federal court, which also binds the Court of Appeal. The decisions of the federal court and the Court of Appeal are binding on the high courts and also have the same effect in the lower courts. Even if a ruling by a higher court is incorrect or rendered per imperium, the lower courts are required to abide by it. Counsel for the appellants attempted to persuade the Court of Appeal in the case of Haris Solid State against Bruno Gentil that the Federal Court's majority ruling in Ramachandran against the Industrial Court of Malaysia was incorrect and should not be followed. So the Court of Appeal was in disagreement. In fact, despite any flaws, this court is obligated to uphold the majority's interpretation of the law in Ramachandran. So it is a ruling by the highest court and establishes law that must be followed. In terms of federal court in era 1, the precedent at the federal court works quite similar in the Court of Appeal in England. Therefore, it is bound by its own previous civil decision as stated in the case of Central Securities against Harun bin Muhammad Zain, where the federal court held that it should be followed the previous case. However, federal court is not bound by its previous criminal decisions as in the case of Ui Hikong against public prosecutor. This is when the appellants were involved in military confrontation operation in Indonesia, where the claim was dismissed at a trial, but both appeals were allowed by the federal court. This decision is contrary to the earlier decision. So moving on to the second era, which is the Supreme Court is the successor of the former federal court. It could be said that the principles of binding precedent should be applied and applicable to the Supreme Court as well. But there is opinion saying that the Supreme Court is the highest appellate court and it should not bind itself, similar to the principle applied by the Privy Council. So, according to Section 69(4) of the Courts of Judicature Act, the Supreme Court was bound by its prior decision made when exercising its appellate jurisdiction, which was the prior decision in the case of Lai Tai Sang against Faber Merlin, when it exercised its original jurisdiction under the federal constitution. So, in the case where the Supreme Court does not review its own jurisdiction, you could refer according to Abdul Hamid, where it may be essential to overturn its own prior ruling. Therefore, it can be said that while Supreme Court is bound by its own judgment, it also has the freedom to depart from them. Any court was given per incurium, where the decision given in ignorance or forgetfulness or some inconsistency statutory provisions does not have the binding power over lower courts for the reason that the decisions demonstrably wrong or insufficient to use as evidence. So if the facts of the case are relevant to and similar to the earlier case from the federal court, the Court of Appeal cannot reject the federal court's ruling. This is because, as stated in Section 3 of the Civil Law Act 1956, Malaysia has adopted the doctrine of stare decisis, which English courts used before. However, if the decision was made per incurium, the Court of Appeal may reject the federal court's ruling. So the jurisdiction of courts in Malaysia states that if a decision was rendered per incurium, the Court of Appeal is not required to follow it if the new decision conflicts with the old one. Instead, it could choose to do so. So, according to legal precedents, the High Court judge is required to follow the Court of Appeal's ruling. So, in the hierarchy of the Malaysian judicial system, judicial precedent is a system where a judge of a court makes a decision and the court at the level or the courts below it are obligated to follow that decision if the illegal point, facts, and situation in the case are similar. So, since the High Court is lower than the Court of Appeal, the High Court judge has no other choices but must follow the binding decision made by the Court of Appeal previously.